What fosters a culturally diverse society with interfaith harmony, both in the Umayyad Caliphate and currently? I will answer from within the framework of Islam, which has from its beginnings promoted interfaith harmony. A caliph or a khalifa is in essence anyone who does God's work on earth. We are all, in that sense, from a Muslim point of view, meant to be khalifas of God, or stewards of God, as the Bible preaches. And among all the damage that ISIS did was its harm to the idea of a caliphate. Many Middle Eastern families have passed down through the generations fond memories of the Ottoman Caliphate, when Jews, Muslims and Christians mingled together hospitably and peacefully as neighbors. And the Muslim Umayyads in Spain from the Middle Ages are remembered for the convivencia, or the harmony of faiths, they practiced in southern Spain or Andalusia, where they ruled. These caliphates promoted interfaith harmony because the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, did so in their commands and teachings. The Quran is explicit. Had God willed, He would have made us one people who follow one faith or one religion. But God tells us in the Quran that He made us different, both in culture, in language and religion, so that you may know one another across those differences. To know in this context means to understand and to affirm each other, or as the Bible puts it, to love your neighbor as you love yourself. Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, put these teachings into practice when he established covenants with the Jews and Christians of his day, guaranteeing their freedom to observe their faiths within the framework of the growing Islamic polity. And this was recognized by all of the caliphates, including the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and the Ottoman Caliphate as well as the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain. Lately, I've been thinking that the religious key to cultural diversity and interfaith harmony in any society of any kind is what I call a God-centered view of religion. God established diverse ways to Him based on the diversity He ordained within humanity. Muslims believe that God sent a prophet to every nation of the earth to teach them about God and to live a God-centered life. When we see our religion from God's point of view, we understand it to be one of many, like the various colors of white light. But when we absolutize our religion, when we take it for the only one, we cut off the possibility of interfaith harmony. If I can borrow from the vocabulary of capitalism, I'd say that the key to interfaith harmony are religious people of different faiths who have invested spiritually in God Incorporated rather than, say, in Muhammad Incorporated or Moses Incorporated or Jesus Incorporated. If we can take our key religious teachers as regional managers of the one God, with the one God as the one and only CEO or chairman of the board, we are well on our way to interfaith peace. Where does the American dream come from? What is its basis that welcomes immigrants and minorities, having a shared public discourse with progress towards interfaith harmony? I was born in Kuwait to Egyptian parents. I grew up in Great Britain, Malaysia, and Egypt, and I came to the United States in 1965 when I was 17, where I have lived ever since. I got my college education here at Columbia, a couple of blocks from here, attended graduate school, and became a naturalized citizen in 1979. I raised my family here, and I therefore feel I can speak directly to the immigrant experience of the American dream, which I have experienced from within. What stirs the imagination of so many immigrants are the simple but immensely pregnant assertions in the Declaration of Independence, in the American Declaration of Independence, that states that all of us are created equal, and in our founding documents that we in America are working towards a more perfect union. We are not there yet, and we may never get there, because perfection is hard to achieve. But we have the foundations in an ideal of equality. We have the future goal of a perfect union. The American dream straddles that foundation and goal. The dream is a nation of true equals in the perfect union we have built together across our differences. Where does the American dream come from? Many Americans may be surprised to learn that it comes, from my perspective at least, in part from the Prophet Muhammad and the Islamic legal tradition. Many Americans may not know this, and probably don't, but a representation of the Prophet Muhammad, along with many other of the world's great lawgivers, graces a monumental frieze in the United States Supreme Court building. And Thomas Jefferson had in his library a copy of the Quran. Over time, Muslim jurists extracted from the Quran the chief goals of Islamic law, which are to secure 5 or 6 principles, namely life, property, family, dignity, freedom of mind, and freedom of religion. I imagine that when Jefferson wrote of the universal rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he had in mind, among other things, what he knew of Islam. If America has been a nation of immigrants, as John Kennedy called us back in 1958 in his book of that title, it's because of the American dream. Immigrants to America have brought with them all the religions of the world. Both Islam and the US Constitution guarantee freedom of religion, and they do so, and can do so, at least in part, because according to our great American motto, with which all Muslims agree, in God we trust. That is to say, because God ordained all the religions, we can trust Him to sustain all religious people in whatever faith comes to them most naturally. What better formula for interfaith harmony is there than that? What is happening today to disrupt this ideal? What's chiefly happening is that we are losing our sense of who the true chairman or CEO of all of our religions and all our cultural identities, who is God. We have promoted to that top spot people, places, ideas that don't belong there, whether they are political leaders, pieces of land, or cultural identities. When we do so, we substitute a partial view of reality for the full view of it. We imagine ourselves as players opposed to each other in a zero-sum game of competition, as though life itself were a football game, rather than as collaborative stewards on earth, or khalifas, ambassadors, or God's emissaries in fulfilling God's work on earth. I like to think of it this way. Just as for early modern astronomers, the movements of the planets fell into place when seen from a heliocentric or sun-centered perspective, rather than a geocentric or earth-centered perspective, so religious pluralism and interfaith harmony make the most perfect sense when we see religious life from God's perspective rather from our own perspective. When we fall into any kind of parochial view of life, with anything other than God at the center of it, our values skew and our behaviors falter. This is why we say there's no God but God. We then lose our sense that we share a national story, a point which our public intellectuals such as David Brooks have been noting for some time. A national story or narrative that holds us all must make for a very wide tent indeed. We cannot all see ourselves as white men and white women descended from the Puritans, or, on the other hand, as natives whose roots in the land go back a millennium or more. I would take my cue for our national narrative and our national story from the Declaration of Independence, when it speaks by the authority of the laws of nature and of nature's God. Jefferson alludes there to a God above all religion, all culture, and all nationalist identity. The God of nature, the God of creation, is the God of the universe and of all that it subsumes. Only a God so broadly conceived can underwrite a story wide enough to hold within it all of us as Americans. And there he is, that God, at the foundation of our nation, in the immortal words of Thomas Jefferson. If we can begin to tell our national story from that starting point, we will find our way, God willing, back to the capacious American dream. What happens when religious beliefs become involved in politics and nationalism? Our work in the world to heal it or to repair it, as our Jewish friends say when they call us to practice tikkun olam, is a task that must necessarily bring our religious beliefs to bear. When, for example, I vote for my candidate of choice in the polling booth, I am motivated at least in part by my values, by how well I think that individual will implement God's will on earth, whatever they might hold for their own religious beliefs. Politicians do not need expressly to believe in God in order to do God's work. The problems arise when we reduce God to the status of cheerleader for one political or social or ethnic team. It is another case of overinvestment in anything less than God Incorporated. I've been thinking recently about what we mean in Islam by the notion of sin. That word has so many negative connotations for non-religious people, but for me, the word simply connotes what naturally happens within us whenever we take anything but God as the central focus and energy source. I don't need to conceive of some harsh judge, old man with a white beard up in the clouds, meting out punishments. What happens is a matter of course when the ultimate of my life is anything but God, is that my energies for constructive action disperse, diffuse, and diminish. I become uncentered, unfocused, unhappy, and prey to divisive influences. By extension, this is what happens to a people who act from a false and diminished sense of who God really is. And this, which relates to what our Buddhist friends call the law of karma, is what I understand to have happened to all the perpetrators of terrorist violence we have witnessed over the past decades. They are the worst case scenarios of religion mixing in a toxic way with politics. So-called Islamic terrorists mistakenly think that to establish an Islamic state by violence is the right thing to do. They do not see that as far as Islamic law is concerned, the states that are most in sync with Muslim ideals secure for their citizens life, property, family, dignity, freedom of mind, or academic freedom and freedom of religion. And by these criteria, America is more Islamic, quote unquote, than many Muslim majority states. The God underwriting such a state has to be the universal God of all, the God Jefferson referenced in the Declaration of Independence, and the God that can start any nation off on an edifying and uniting national story. By all means, let our politics reflect the reverence that religious people have for the one true God, but let us take care not to fall for nationalistic co-options of God to self-serving, self-promoting, and divisive purposes. What is the relationship between politics and paranoia, particularly with regard to immigration and diversity? Here, I think we need to reference the economy. For a long time, I felt that the root of most human conflict is competition over scarcity of goods. Too few have too much, too many have too little. Bernie Sanders taught us that, if nothing else, in the 2016 presidential election. Paranoia is irrational fear. It is fear of losing what we have to people or to forces beyond our control. Fear is especially paranoid when directed towards people who in reality pose no threat, such as the vast majority of immigrants who work most often to expand the economy rather than to contract or siphon away jobs. Politics becomes paranoid when it enacts laws or policies that irrationally punish or persecute people who have done no harm, but rather good, as in fact most immigrants have done. Paranoia cannot arise within a God-centered view of reality. The reason is simple, because we know we are not in control in the first place. Everything we are and own can vanish in a moment. This is why we Muslims preface almost any plan we make with the phrase Insha'Allah, which means if God wills it, or God willing. But our lack of full control is just the negative half of its corresponding positive, which is that God, in fact, controls everything. He is absolute. And that there is nothing to fear if we live a God-centered life. My experience as a practicing Muslim is that faith in God and love of neighbor go hand in hand. As one intensifies, so does the other. Each is really the expression of the other. We could say the love of God expresses in a vertical direction what the love of neighbor does in a horizontal direction, and vice versa. The neighbor is the person who stands near, of whatever faith, whatever color, whatever ethnic identity or country of origin, because God is the one God who created us all. If we are truly one nation under one God, as our Pledge of Allegiance teaches, there can be no paranoid fear of immigrants or of other countries. The more American we are, the more welcoming we must be to all of our immigrant neighbors. And just recently, French President Macron addressed our Congress and received several standing ovations by expressing and reminding us of the importance of some of these principles regarding our joint responsibility to take care of the earth, to tikkun olam, the earth, to heal it, and to work together, both as nations, as governments, as peoples of all varieties and all kinds and of all work. Thank you, and may God bless you all.